Well, good evening and welcome to the History Sessions live with Ivan Bunn and myself, Stephen. I'm here actually on behalf of the Rogues Shanty Chorus and a slightly wider heritage project called the Unique Coastal Cultural and Musical Heritage of Waveney. And that's a project that looks to explore and celebrate the local associated heritage of the fishing industry. And as part of that, we have an authentic sea shanty choir based in Lowestoft, and that sea shanty choir, as a result of lockdown and COVID-19, are currently no longer able to meet. But what we have been doing is we've been having some virtual rehearsals, which have kind of evolved into broadcasts on Facebook and YouTube, and they've been extremely popular. And we had been talking to a wonderful guy called Ivan Bunn, who sat there waiting, ready and primed, local author and historian and legend, I'll say. And if there's much else to know about Lowestoft that Ivan doesn't know, I don't think it's worth knowing, although I'm sure he'd back that comment away. But Ivan has been talking to us over the last 4 weeks about the history of Lowestoft, various aspects of it, from the Battle of Lowestoft to the history of Sparrow's Nest. Next week, Ivan is going to be giving a talk about Kirkley, and so I think we're going to bring him on screen. And this evening, absolutely to my delight, Ivan is going to be talking about the trial of the Lowestoft witches. And yeah, so let us know if you're watching. Please click share. And oh look, we've got a few comments already, actually, Ivan. Linda Boyce says patiently waiting for the next installment. Chris Collins says good evening all. Julie Grove says bought Ivan's book years ago, lent it to someone and never got it back. Well, Julie, you need to get it back or buy another one. Liz Jackson says wow, nearly missed you. Janice Marjoram, evening all. Lisa Eagle, hello Lisa, good evening all. And Chris Collins got the book at Seagull Theatre. Jerry Paul says, a legend indeed. There you go, Ivan. I'm not on my own in thinking that. How are you doing, Ivan? Are you all right?
Okay, thanks. Good evening, fellow travellers. We've survived another week. I hope you've all had a good week, one way or the other, all things considered. I expect you've all been rushing around the shops today as well, haven't you?
I've been queuing up.
Yeah. Right, yeah. Okay, so...
I've been queuing up at Sports Direct.
So,
no.
Have you? You know, I've got some half-price boxer shorts there, but you don't want to know about that. Yeah, so this evening, just a background. Yeah, I want to talk about the Lowestoft witches. Again, if you sat in, or if you know me already, or you sat in on the very first of these that I did, that's probably the most boring of the four that we've done. Oh no, this is the fifth one now, isn't it? Yeah, see, I'm losing track of time. And a sign that I'm losing the track of time. Last Monday, I either got so excited about doing this, or I'd lost a week somewhere. I put the wrong colour wheelie bins out later.
No.
No. My neighbour had to put them in and put the right ones out.
Oh, well,
anyway. 5 weeks ago we did the first one. I talked a lot about myself as a historian, how I came to be where I am, and particularly my principal history as a historian in the history of witchcraft in England and New England in the 16th and particularly the 17th century. The case that led me there right back in the 1970s when I discovered about the Lowestoft witch trial, and that's kind of been my I think my family would say my obsession ever since. In 1997, working in conjunction with my very good late friend and mentor Professor Gilbert Geis from the University of California, Irvine, we wrote probably the most comprehensive report of an English witchcraft trial in this book, which is still, after all the years it's been out, 23 years, it's still in print. I don't want to talk too much about the book. I just want to talk a bit about how I came to be here, the Lowestoft witches. And I give lots of talks. The witches took me into history, particularly the history of Lowestoft, and everything kind of spun off from there. So this evening, I want to focus on the witchcraft trial. Now, as Stephen rightly said, I'm just going to push my chair back. That's a bit better. As Stephen rightly said, I'm going to focus on the Lowestoft witchcraft trial tonight. There was only ever one that we know of. I talked the week before last about the Battle of Lowestoft in 1665. Last session I was here, I talked about the history or what Lowestoft was like in 1665 to set the picture of how many people lived here, using a couple of maps, which I've got them again in the presentation. I was able, I hope, to give some idea of what a different community Lowestoft was in the mid-17th century to what it is today. And also I talked a bit about the governance, if you want to use that word, of Lowestoft, who was responsible for what, who ran what, etc., etc., etc. And of course, I thought I'd continue that, and nice lead-in from that would be to talk a bit about the trial of the Lowestoft witches. Whenever I use the word witches, you have to see little inverted commas around the word witches, because I'm not convinced that they were witches, not in the sense of the 17th century. And I also want to make the two witches people. Before I start the presentation, I hope the presentation is going to work all right again. As I said, I got a rather weird setup. I've got my little tablet thing pointing at the screen of my laptop, and so you're actually getting a second-hand thing. I hope the pictures are clear enough, and well, clear enough for you to be able to get the gist of what I'm talking about. But before we do that, I want to actually share with you. I want you to meet the witches first. Let's meet them as people, as women, not as witches who pop up in the trial and never say anything, but using this original trial report. Now, again, I'm sure some of you know about this. The original trial was recorded by eyewitness in this report entitled The Trial of Witches. I'll go into more details about the trial as I go through the presentation. 56 pages long. It's probably one of the most detailed and comprehensive records of an English witch trial in the 17th century. And probably before that as well. The Lancashire witches is quite a complex, well reported, but this is exclusively about the two women. And they crop up in here, as do all the witnesses and what they said. We can hear their voices again. And but the witches in this trial report, as you'll see when I do the presentation, they don't have a voice. But fortunately, with a lot of research locally, I was able to reconstruct very, not particularly detailed, but a background picture of these two so-called witches, so who they were. So what I'm going to do first, and I don't normally do this for when I give my presentation, I just leap straight into the presentation. But this evening, I thought before doing the presentation, I would let you meet these two ladies, these elderly ladies. They were probably younger than I am today, so I'm not going to call them old ladies. These elderly ladies as people from what little we knew about them, and then talk just a few words about during my description of them and where they lived and who they were and who their husbands were, and etc., etc. And during that, just cast out one or two ideas where they come out actually in their story as to just why their neighbours decided that they were witches. So that's what I'm going to do first. And because my memory is getting bad and I don't want to get anything wrong, this afternoon I typed up a couple of biographies of the two women from all the research notes that I had, details from the book and that. So I'm basically going to read to you what I wrote this afternoon, and it's up. I do have Lowestoft, which is website as well, and the information is on there, so you don't have to make notes if you don't want to. And I'm not going to be asking questions at the end either. So the two women were Rose Cullender and Amy Denny. Now, I'm going to start with Rose Cullender because a lot more is known about her. So Rose Cullender was not a native of Lowestoft. She first appears in the town records as Rose Hicks, a single woman, when she married William Cullender. We don't know what his occupation was, on the 18th of April, 1625. This is the first reference to her husband, to her and her husband in Lowestoft. There's nothing about them before that date, so we know they're newcomers to the town. They're settlers, if you like. They're outsiders, which might have some bearing on it. When Rose walked up the aisle of St Margaret's Church in Lowestoft in 1625, she was 6 months pregnant. Her first child, Elizabeth, was baptized there at the same church on the 24th of June that same year. By all accounts, from the research I've done, there's nothing not back in the day. There's no real stigma in a woman going to get married pregnant. Right through certainly to the 19th century in Suffolk, and I'm sure elsewhere, possibly even into the 20th century, certainly the late 19th century. At this time, you needed, if you were going to get married and you reached old age, you wanted to be sure that you were both fertile enough to produce children who could look after you. There's no social services, there's no handouts, there's nothing. You become paupers if you've got no family to support you. So quite often, I think in Suffolk in the 19th century, a couple who were engaged to get married were allowed to sleep together. It was called bundling. So she's pregnant when she walks up the aisle, and over the next 12 years, Rose and William produced another 8 children. There was Thomas, 1627, Susan, 1629, William, 1630, twins, Peter and Mary, born in 1632, Bridget, born in 1634, Mary, born in 1635, and another Mary, because the 1635 Mary, like 4 of her siblings, died of the plague in Lowestoft in 1635. And the last one was, as I said, Mary, who was born in 1637. So this is a large family. 5 of these children died before reaching the age of 10, 4 of them during the plague period of 1635-36 in Lowestoft. So she's a wife, she's a mother. We know where she lived. Soon after their marriage, Rose and William moved into a tenement at the western end of Old Blue Anchor Lane, what was Duke Street, well, still is Duke's Head Street, what bit is left of it. And the house they lived in was a large subdivided property, formerly called the Hall House. Interestingly, and again, if we're looking for links as to, so should said anybody who was here last week, if they've got memories and were paying attention, the population, men, women, and children of Lowestoft in the mid 1600s was between 1800 and 2000. It's a small, tight-knit community perched on the top of the cliff. And so everybody would have basically known everybody else. And adjacent to the Hall House, or the part of the Hall House that they lived in, was a barn with a large yard. and it was used for storage by a brewer named Francis Owen. Francis Owen had a number of children. Amongst them was Anne, a teenager in the 1630s when the Cullenders lived there, who, after her marriage as Anne Landerfield, she was one of the main witnesses against Rose at her trial. So Anne Landerfield would have known Rose Cullender from her childhood, from Anne's childhood. Interestingly enough, close by to the Hall House, where the Cullenders were living in the 1630s, there was a tavern called the Sun, or the Sun Inn. This was owned by John Soane, who many 25 years later was another principal witness at the trial of Rose Cullender for witchcraft. So we can link these families together. Now we know that in 1638, a gentleman by the name of Richard Church of Lowestoft mortgaged his house in Swan Lane. Swan Lane, that's now Mariners Street. The house has long since gone, but he mortgaged his house in Swan Lane to Rose's husband, William. So that means that William had disposable money. So the Cullenders weren't poor people. He could loan money on a mortgage. Now, 3 years later, the Cullenders actually bought that house from Church, and it became their new home. So they moved out of the old Blue Anchor Lane, Duke's Head Street, up into the Swan Lane, and that's where they settled. Within a year, William Cullender was dead. Details of his death are unclear. There's no record of his death in Lowestoft, but the death is recorded in the Manor Court records. He left no will. He was possibly a mariner or a merchant or a fisherman, and that Rose's eldest son, Thomas, was only 14 years old, too young to inherit the property. As I said, there's no will, because Rose, as a woman, couldn't inherit it in her own right unless her husband left it to her in the will. So the property was put into the hands of a trustee, and eventually, when it reached the age of 21, Thomas became the owner of the property when he reached his majority, and the property was transferred to him. So we're not looking at poor, beggarly folk, paupers living on the breadline. We're looking at a fairly middling family here. When she was arrested in 1662, Rose Cullender was still living in this house. As I said, it's now owned by her son Thomas. She was arrested as a witch in that year, and it was there in the house, and I'll cover this in the talk about the actual trial. That's where she was stripped and searched for witches' marks. At that time, she had two surviving children. Thomas, who by this age was married, and her eldest daughter, Susan, aged 33. Susan never married, and she's pretty certain that she was still living at home with her mother and caring for her aging mother in the Swan Lane abode. We don't know when Rose Cullender was born, because, as I said, as Rose Hicks, she appears in the town when she gets married. But if we assume when she married William in 1625, she was at the average age of marriage for women in this period, which was about 25 years old. She would have been approximately 62 years old in 1662 when she was tried and executed at Bury St Edmunds. Rose was also a grandmother to Bethiah and Samuel Cullender, the two children of her son Thomas. He inherited, he owned the property, obviously, and 7 months after his mother's execution, in October 1662, she was executed in the March, he transferred the Swan Lane property into his sister's name, and that's Susan, and it remained hers until 1688. Thomas, her brother, had died at Lowestoft and was buried there in 1676, aged 49, and so the property now slowly passes out of the family Susan, Rose Cullender's surviving child, died intestate, no will, at the age of 59. She had no heirs, and the ownership of the house and the property reverted to her niece, Bethia Fox, who was married now, the surviving brother of her the surviving child of her brother Thomas. Obviously, Bethia, possibly because the connotations with her grandmother, who had been hanged as a witch, she immediately after inheriting the property, and we know all of this from the town records, she sold it on. And she never moved into it. She obviously didn't want it. And she sold the building on. And the building was demolished in the late 1950s, early 60s, when this area was redeveloped. And the last trace of the Cullenders disappeared from the town. So we're not looking at Harridan with a pointed hat with a broomstick. We're looking at a wife, a mother, somebody's daughter, a grandmother, a woman who was going about her business in the town. As I said, Rose Cullender differs somewhat from many, many other victims of witchcraft accusations. She doesn't fit into the usual model of an accused woman. She and her husband had some money, obviously, because he could loan some on mortgage, and they owned property, and they were probably reasonably well off. And she was obviously had money coming in from somewhere as well, because even after the death of her husband, Rose still had to make regular, as a householder, she still had to make regular contributions to the poor rate in the town. Had she been destitute or a pauper, she would have been getting handouts from it. So, but unfortunately, we'll never probably know what made her fellow townsfolk accuse her of being a witch. We can speculate, as I say, till the cows come home, but I go into that a little bit during the presentation. I'm going to quickly go through now. So our other lady, a slightly different person story altogether there. She was a woman, a widow, a wife, a mother, Amy Denny. And it's a little bit of an irony that this trial report gives her name as Duny, D-U-N-Y. When we eventually found in the National Archive the original indictments from the trial, there's no doubt about it that her surname is Denny, D-E-N-N-Y, a surname that's very common in the Lowestoft area back then, and still is. And we know, unlike Rose, been able to find out very, very little about Amy or her family. There's no birth or record of her birth or marriage in the Lowestoft records. The parish registers carry only one entry directly related to her. This records the baptism of a child, Samuel, in 1651. So 11 years before the trial, she was still of childbearing age. And what we learned from that her husband's name was John. So she was married to John Denny. And so it's pretty safe to assume from that that neither Amy or her husband were natives. They were settlers. They weren't natives of Lowestoft. Again, something to bear in mind when we're looking for scapegoats. Parish registers note the burial of John Denny in Lowestoft in 1657. We can't be 100% certain, but we're pretty certain that it was Amy's husband, for she was a widow when the trial took place. There's a slight problem here because there is another John Denny living in the town at the same time. But through the research and, as I said when we first talked about this, research into historical research, and then the conclusions you come to, it's like 10% information and 90% speculation based on that information, and we've come to the conclusion that the John Denny that died in there is her husband, and the John Denny who lived in the town at the same time, because of his age difference, etc., was not her husband. If somebody could prove me wrong, fair enough. And there is a possibility that Amy and her husband actually originated from Beccles. Beccles, I'm sure everybody knows it, but in case we've got anybody living further away, that's a nice market town, 8 miles to the west of Lowestoft. We find a marriage there. Now, again, somewhat tenuous, I know, but Amy, in actual fact, is a pet name for Emma, because many, many Emmas, and my daughter included, she's in it, get called Emmy, and Emmy often becomes Amy. But we know that in 1634, just nice sort of time date, in the parish registers, we came across the record of the marriage of one John Denny to Emma Heckleton, October 1634. Amy, as I said, is a common pet form of Emma, being a corruption of Emmy. Now, one of the most damning allegations made against Amy Denny was that she was related to a known witch. Now, during the Great Witch Hunt, led by Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch finder general, in 1645, a woman by the name of Margaret Eccleton from the village of Linstead, 9 miles south of Beccles, was accused of being a witch and was found guilty by during Hopkins' Inquisition. Now, given the vagaries of 17th century spelling in the parish register and the records, this Eccleton or Eccleston might well have been related to Emma or Amy Heckleton, who married John Denny, who possibly or probably came and settled in Lowestoft in the 1650s, or just before, when she gave birth here. This is all, of course, speculative and somewhat tenuous. One day, perhaps, either myself or somebody in years to come will either find the evidence to prove or disprove this. I've been trying since the 1980s and still haven't come across anything. John and Amy Denny, if it was them, they had 3 children baptized at Beccles, the last being in 1642. After that, the family disappears from the Beccles records. Now, oddly enough, 2 years later, for the first time, the name John Denny suddenly occurs with great frequency in the manor court books of Lowestoft, at the court baron. Now, the court baron, as we were talking about last week, met monthly and dealt mainly with the copyhold of property belonging to the manor, but it also adjudicated on simple lawsuits involving injury, trespass, debt, as long as the debts or the injuries didn't exceed the sum of 40 shillings, £2, then they could be dealt with at the manor court book, at the manor court. So the first time in 1642, where are we? Yeah, 2 years later, 1642, the John and Amy Denny disappear from Beccles. 1644, for the first time, the name John Denny occurs with great frequency in the manor court books of Lowestoft. Between November 1644 and December 1653, his name is brought before the court in that short period of 9 years, no less than 69 times. In all but 3 of them, he's there as the defendant. Somebody is suing him for small debts, for what today we'd call antisocial behaviour. Unfortunately, and as I've made a note here, no other person's name appears with such regularity as that of John Denny. Unfortunately, because the names only contain the names of the plaintiff and the defendant, together with a verdict, it's not possible to say why he was brought to the court so many times, except that he must have exhibited incredible antisocial tendencies towards all and sundry in Lowestoft. Unfortunately, the Manor Court records of Lowestoft, which unfortunately very shortly are going to be moved from the Lowestoft Record Office back to Ipswich, go 1580, I think, to early 1930s, a complete run of huge volumes. Unfortunately, there's one missing volume, and that's the volume between 1653 and 1657. When the records resume in 1657, John Denny is conspicuous by his absence. So whether this is the John Denny who's married to Amy, we don't know. Whether they were a family who just kicked against the traces socially in the town all the time they were here, we don't know. The note I made here, if Amy's husband or his family did consistently cause civil injuries to their neighbours, perhaps this was one source of the vindictiveness against Amy that led to her untimely demise on the gallows as a witch. And interestingly enough, we know there was some contact with others at the trial. The witnesses, Amy Denny rented a subdivided house at the extreme southern end of Lowestoft. This house was owned by Cornelius Landerfield, and Cornelius Landerfield had married Anne Ewan, who, as a teenager, had grown up in Duke's Head Street, next door to Rose and William Cullender. So again, we got these links. I could put in lots more links and bore you to death with them. I'm sorry, that's my little thing bleeping on there. Nothing important. So anyway, that's the two women that we're dealing with. The two, and I emphasize the women that we're dealing with, not necessarily the witches that we're dealing with. Those are the two women who are accused of witches. A very, very brief thumbnail sketch of them. But when we go through the trial, which I'm going to do in a very short moment when I've had a drink of water, and I'll be honest with you, pop out to the loo. So I'm going to hand you back to Stephen just for a couple of minutes while I disappear from the scene, get a drink of water, and then we'll get on with the presentation if everybody is happy for me to do that. It's really weird not seeing people's faces and knowing how many have fell asleep.
No, I tell you what, Ivan, I'm going to feature some comments now because actually there's some lovely ones here. So Jerry Paul says, a legend indeed. And then Nikki Gilbody says, I agree with Jerry Poole. And then several more. So I'm just going to mute Ivan to make sure we're... then Belinda Down says, good evening, Ivan. John Ward is watching. He says, great book. Lizzie Long, hello, good evening, she says. Janice Marjoram says, I think Janice is giving you a plug, Ivan, for your several of your books. But she says, Waterstones are doing deliveries next Friday for pre-orders if books are in stock. If not, orders can be taken online. And actually, if you look for an independent bookstore, Beccles Books, funnily enough, in Beccles, they can order books very, very fast as well. Maggie Clark, good evening, Stephen and Ivan. Jackie Draper, hi everyone. Jerry Poole, hello Chris. Oh, people are talking to each other, Ivan, and not us, but that's fine.
That's all.
Yeah, Liz Jackson, been waiting all week for this. And then Bill Kitchen, hi folks from Brightlinsea. Anita, hello Anita. Hi Ivan and Stephen, and then just some more really. Lovely, yeah, just some lovely comments. So just while Ivan's popped off, I'm going to mute him so we don't hear anything we shouldn't do. But just while Ivan's popped off, I'm going to just mention what we're doing here at all, really. And so I run an organisation called the Voice Cloud, and the Voice Cloud is running really a lot. We're in the middle of a 4-year project, which is looking to explore and celebrate the heritage of Lowestoft and Waveney and North Suffolk, in particular the maritime industry, and we explore that through folk music, in particular through sea shanties, which was the kind of the work songs of sailors and fishermen in Lowestoft and who sailed off the coast of Lowestoft. The wider project is called the Unique Coastal Cultural and Musical Heritage of Waveney, and so as part of that project, there's several strands to it really. One is that we have our very own authentic fishing choir called the Rogues Shanty Chorus, which is the page we're broadcasting from. But we also work in schools, and we work with very young children as well, just to kind of celebrate and kind of bring the music and the heritage that we rightly should celebrate to existing and new audiences. And so normally on a Tuesday evening we would be rehearsing with our sea shanty choir, and of course there's quite a large musical hiatus, or an everything hiatus at the moment, because of COVID and because of because of lockdown. And when we first kind of came into that, we had to announce that our project was being suspended based on the fact that it was not safe for people to mix, and that was the government advice. But as a result of that, we had many people who were regular attenders of our choir and our project who said, is there something we can do to try and keep people connected? And so we just went online mid-March, and we started to run some virtual rehearsals, and they kind of evolved into broadcasts. And we've just done, I don't even know, I think we've done 13 or 14 already on a weekly basis on a Tuesday evening. And so if you're not busy on a Tuesday and you'd like to find out more, just kind of check in. We have kind of special guests on a Tuesday. Tomorrow we actually feature 2 fantastic Lowestoft guests. The first will be a guy called Zeb Soames, who you probably would recognise as the voice of the shipping forecast, and he's a broadcaster but comes from Lowestoft. And then we've got John and Lynn Ward, fantastic musicians, well known around Lowestoft and also much further afield within the folk world. But last week we had a group called El Pony Pisado from Barcelona. We've had people from Scotland and Canada, just all to celebrate the maritime industry and folk music. But aside from that, we had been in chats with Ivan about the possibility of Ivan coming along to deliver some talks about the history of Lowestoft to our group, and we were kind of in the middle of that when lockdown started. But we thought we're not going to let lockdown stop us, and so we've gone online with them. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you've got 4 previous talks that you can watch again. You can also watch this again, and we'll be back next week with number 6. And Ivan always invites comments and questions. So if you have anything that you would like specifically Ivan to address or talk about in a future session, or Ivan has spoken about something tonight that you want to check again or didn't quite catch the term for or something, let us know in the comments, and we'll come to that at some point. But Ivan's back. He's got his drink and he's raring to go.
Yep. Okay, right. What I have to do now, this is a tricky bit. I managed to disconnect myself a week ago doing this. Fortunately, I got back to you quite quickly. I now have to move this little pad thing that I've got here and put it in front of the laptop, and then extinguish all the lights in the room, so the screen is nice and bright, and hopefully then for the next 50 minutes or so walk you through a brief outline of the trial of Amy Denny and Rose Cullender. So I'm just going to get up and move this, hopefully not drop it, hopefully put it in the right place. This is the slightly most stressful part of the evening. This is where I managed to disconnect myself last time.
I'm just going to bring some comments on screen, actually, while you say that. Ivan, first one is from Steve Fingleton. Enjoying the talk, guys. Thanks. Lizzie Long says, still awake. Lol, loving it. Oh, thank you, Lizzie. Oh, I should take no credit. It's all Ivan, but good to hear from you, and thanks for kind of tuning in. Carly Franklin says, evening, Stephen and Ivan finally got here. Just got in from work, so I missed the first bit. Okay, well, you can rewind, Carly, and or watch again. And then we've got a question, actually, from Steve Fingleton, and he says, was it common not to write a will if you had property and money in this time? So maybe we'll come to that towards the end. And Chris Collins says, we have Denny's in our family in the USA. And then final comment that I'll pick is Jerry Poole. Unless you've done it already and I've missed it, I'd love to hear about the Vikings coming up the running waters. Do you know, I don't think we have, Jerry, but I'll let Ivan come on to that later. Anyway, Ivan, I think your position for your slides.
Does that look okay? I can't see that too well, unfortunately.
Looks good. It looks good.
Right, you haven't got to look at me anymore. You've just got to look at my screen, and I'll talk you the trial of Amy Denny and Rose Colander. I'm just making certain that the whole screen is okay. So this is the talk that I would normally give at one of my venues by invitation. So it's the trial of Amy Denny and Rose Colander, 10th to the 17th of March 1662, now known forever and a day as the Lowestoft Witches. And as I said in front of the camera a little while back, the book on the left, I hope you can see my little red spot, that's the title page of the 56-page trial report that all of this information comes from, and that's the front cover of the book that Professor Geitz and myself wrote together and published in 1997, and it's still in print. I just want to go, before we go into the trial, well, let me just do this for the sake of the people who weren't here with me last week talking about. So 17th century Lowestoft, this is going to be extremely brief. So here is the parish of Lowestoft in the mid 1680 is the date on there, but the parish really didn't change much until the early 1800s in size. So you can see the grey area to the right, that's the town on the cliff top, and it's a very, very small town, a very, very small, almost totally self-sufficient community with between 1,800 and 2,000 men, women and children. There was some fishing, but as you can see from the arable fields there and the pastures and the meadows, it was also quite a large agricultural parish as well, although there was fishing off the beach at Lowestoft. And this is the town itself. Yeah, I'm just checking that the screen is okay there. I hope you can all see that okay. And so the grey area is the area of the town itself. So quickly explain where we are. If I can find the right button to push on here. Right at the top there, for those who know it, that's what's Bellevue Park today. Here is St Margaret's Plain, where the first and last pub is. Down the bottom here is the bottom of what today is Old Nelson Street. Here's High Street running down the middle. Here's Wapload Road and the Deans below the cliff to the east of Wapload Road. And there is at this point at this point in time, and there won't be for over 150 years, a beach village of any sort. So that's basically the town. Just out of interest, for all you drinkers, if you could get a time machine and come back to Lowestoft to this period, the town High Street, 3/4 of a mile, give or take in length. Along that High Street, there were 7 inns and taverns, and one of them located just a little way back in one of the back streets, the White Horse, as it was called, in White Horse Street, all long since gone. So that's a very small community, and I think it's important to bear that in mind, that these people would have known each other pretty well to a greater or lesser degree. I don't think in 17th century Lowestoft you could have many secrets. So the accused, right, I've given you the thumbnail sketches. I don't normally go into too much detail, but I thought this evening my focus would be on the victims up to a point. And so what I've done, I have created a map. Now, this is the map of Lowestoft. It's the same as the coloured one, except it's simpler if I do it in black and white. Up the top here, you've got what today would be Bellevue Park, Sparrow's Nest down here, St Margaret's Plain over here, the bottom of Old Nelson Street here, High Street running up the middle, Watblood Road running along the bottom of the cliffs. That's where all the fish houses are, and net stores and everything to do with the fishing and the smoking of the fish and the herring, etc., etc., etc. That's where they all are. So all of the principal inhabitants are living either in High Street or the back streets. And again, I hope these are coming through clear enough for you to see. So my little box there says Rose Colander. That's the house on Swan Lane, now Mariners Street, where she was living when she was accused of being a witch. Amy Denny's house was right at the very south end, literally now where the roundabout, the large roundabout, is at the bottom of Old Nelson Street. That is where her house was located. I'm going to say a little bit more about her house because it does feature in some of the evidence given against her at the trial. So who are the accusers? Let's have a look at the accusers. If we had a day on this, I could actually go through and give you the biographical details of many of the people who accused her. There isn't the time to do that. But Rose Colander, this is Swan Lane. Sorry, we'll come on to the accusers in a minute. Rose Colander, this is Swan Lane, Mariners Street, the extreme western end, and this was taken in the 1950s, this photograph, and you're looking due east all the way down to High Street. So if you could climb into this photograph, walk down that street until you reach the house at in the far distance, you would be in the High Street, opposite, almost opposite the entrance to Mariners Score, with the town hall on your right and Bayfields on your left. And the house that Rose Colander, and we know this from the Manor Court records, the house that she lived in and the house that she was, is here. That white house is the house that Rose Colander, as a widow, with her daughter Susan, was living in 1662 when she was accused, well, prior to that, when she was being accused of witch. That's the house where her son Thomas would have taken her two little grandchildren along to visit her in the good days before the accusations were made. So this is the family home. Amy Denny's house has long since gone. It was at the bottom of what's Old Nelson Street today, long before, and it was demolished probably in the early 1700s when a small gun battery was built on the site, and the road was diverted round the battery. It's still, when you come down to the roundabout at the bottom of Old Nelson Street, you have to swing round to the left to get onto Battery Green Road, and her house stood there There was another score at that point called Henfield Score, and her house was at the bottom of this not very steep score, and that's where she was living at the time of the witch trials. So who were the accusers? Again, as I said, I could give you names to everybody. So down at the bottom there. Oh, and finally, the little red arrow that you see in the middle before we go on to the accusers, that's the house in Duke's Head Street, Blue Anchor Lane, the Hall House where Amy Denny, where Rose Callender and William lived when they were first married. That's where John Soon, almost next door to them, had a pub called the Sun Inn. He would be one of their accusers, we'll see later in this. And that's also where Mr. Ewan the brewer, the wife of another, the father of another one of her accusers, stored his tons and brewing equipment at the same time that Rose and William Callender were living in that house. And that's where Anne Ewan, later Anne Landerfield, when she got married, that's where she grew up. That's where she would have played, in the yard of a house occupied by Rose Callender. So these people knew each other. Now, who were the accusers? The main man, the man who brought about these accusations, was Samuel Pacey. He lived in a house in the High Street at the top of Wild Score, one of the biggest houses in the town, because he was one of the wealthiest merchants in the town. His family had lived in Lowestoft for at least 3 generations, if not longer. He was one of the most, the wealthiest merchants in the town. He was one of the most respected men in the town. At the time, a lot of people who were thought to be worthy, but always described in the records as being the most sufficient people, and he was one of the most sufficient people of the town. He was a church warden. He was married. He was 38 years old. He'd got 3 children at the time. Susan, aged 14, Elizabeth, aged 12, and Elizabeth had just had her 12th birthday when the accusation started, and Deborah, who was 7 years old. You'll see, I hope you can see, that the names of many of these, some of these people are in red. The red names are the names of people who it is claimed were bewitched either by Rose Callender or Amy Denny. The names in black are the names of the people who gave the evidence, because none of the children who were bewitched could give evidence at the court because they were too ill. So their parents had to give evidence on their behalf. The Margaret Arnold you see on there, that's Samuel Pacey's sister. She'd married a William Arnold, and she'd gone to live in Great Yarmouth. And at one point, so the trial report tells us, Samuel Pacey sent his 2 bewitched girls to Yarmouth to live with his sister to see if a change of air would do them any good. We'll come on a little bit more to Samuel Pacey and his involvement. Who else is there? We'll see in a moment. So here's Samuel Pacey. He was literate up the top left. I don't know how well you can see that. You can actually see his signature. There's the house. It's now 2 shops, the wool shop, and I think it's still an estate agent's or similar next door to immediately south of the score. And there's the back garden. Like most of the houses on the cliff at Lowestoft at that time, on the east side, the houses were owned and lived in at the top of the cliff. There were yards at the back, and most times, especially with Samuel Pacey, he owned the cliff and all the land going down to Wapload Road, where he had his fish houses and storehouses. And in the trial report, he's described as the witness, well, not the witness, the person who compiled the trial report. He's described as a man who carried himself with much soberness during the trial, from whom proceeded no words either of passion or malice, though his children were so greatly afflicted. So how come his children were afflicted? What happened? Samuel Pacey is the man that kicked this all off. He's the instigator of the accusations initially against Amy Denny. And the trial report tells us that in his evidence, and they cite him more or less verbatim as what he said, that he said on the 17th of October, the previous year, remember we're in March 1662 now, the previous October, on the 17th of October, young 7-year-old Deborah had been unwell. And the day being sunshiny and fair, as he described it, he carried her out and sat her on the grassy bank that overlooketh the sea. If you wanted to sit on the grassy bank now, you'd only overlook Birdseye. But down then, there was the Deans to the sea. So he takes Deborah, who's been poorly but's feeling better, he takes her out and sits her on the grassy bank at the rear of the house. And this is the rear of Samuel Pacey's house. Well, it's not his original house. This is a much later bit that's been tagged onto the original house. The original house faces out onto the high street, and he sits her down. He's a fish merchant. It's October. It's the height of the fishing season. He owns 3 fishing boats. They're bringing in herring, and the herring's been cured, and he's selling them on. He's a fish merchant, as well as got his finger in just about every pie that's gone in Lowestoft. And while he's there, while Deborah's sitting in the garden, Amy Denny came down. We would imagine down the score, she wouldn't have gone to the front of the house, him being one of the most the wealthiest and important. She would have come down the score and knocked on the side door, possibly even the gate. And when he went to the door, he told the court she asked if she could buy some herring from him, and he said no. Now, he states quite categorically that she wanted to buy herring. She wasn't begging for herring, she wanted to buy. And it was a tradition in Lowestoft at that time and many years later that the fish merchants would, it was kind of expected of them, sell small pennyworths of herring to the poorer people in Lowestoft, herring being a very nutritious fish. So that it was more or less the sort of a social duty to sell herring to the poorer people of the town, a pennyworth at a time. He refused and he sent her away. A few minutes later, she's back. He tells the court again. She knocked on his door. He went to the door and wanted to buy some herring. He sent her away again. And to her credit, she's persistent. A few minutes later, she's back, banging on his door again, asking for him to sell her herring. This time, he sends her away again. Possibly, we don't know what was said. He didn't tell the court exactly what language he used. He's told the court then that as she went away from his house, she was muttering and cursing. And at that very moment, young Deborah, who was sitting on the grassy bank overlooking the sea, who had been aware of this confrontation between Amy Denny and her dad, fell into strange fits of swounding, as Samuel Pacey described them. And these went on for days. She couldn't eat a lot of the time. She couldn't talk. At times she would be sick and she would vomit up pins and crooked nails, which would be brought to the court. And she screamed and threw a tantrum if they tried to read passages from the Bible to her, especially if the word God or Lord was said. But if the word devil was said, she said that made her feel good. And this went on for a few days, and Samuel Pacey went to see a doctor, a physician, to get some advice. The doctor comes and examines her, says he can't make out what's wrong with the poor girl, and obviously Pacey must have told the physician what had happened with Amy Denny, and the physician says he's pretty certain that this child, that Deborah, is bewitched, and that Amy Denny is responsible for it. With no more ado, Samuel Pacey has Amy Denny put in the stocks at Lowestoft. The stocks were on Goose Green, now St Margaret's Plain, not far from where the first and last pub is at the moment. So she's put in the stocks as a punishment, which was totally not a normal thing to do to somebody who was being accused of being a witch. While she's in the stocks, two people come past, two young women in their 20s, two married women. They've both got small children, so it's possible that they're out taking their children for a walk, and they go to have a look at Amy Denny sitting in the stocks. The women, their names are Jane Buxton and Alice Kittredge, both local girls, both married to local fishermen, and they come to the stocks and they gave their evidence in the court when they asked Amy Denny why she was in the stocks. And apparently she replied to them, according to Jane and Alice, "You know full well why I'm in the stocks." And she went on to say, Mr. Pacey, this is Amy sitting in the stocks, she says, Mr. Pacey should worry about his children, but if he'd had to done for his children what I've had to do for mine, he would really have something to worry about. And so the Jane and Alice say to her, what did you have to do for your children? And she said, Amy says, at one time my children were so sick and ill that they couldn't eat or drink anything. They couldn't swallow anything. So I had to feed them through a tap. And a few days, the next day, we don't know if this information was conveyed by Jane and Alice to Samuel Pacey, or it became common knowledge what Amy had said to them, like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. Elizabeth, the 12-year-old sister of Deborah, Elizabeth Pacey, she is suddenly taken with strange fits of swooning, just like her sister, but she can't eat. And Samuel Pacey told the court that concerned for her life, because she's not eating or drinking anything, he had to feed her through a tap. And I had to do a little bit of research. I thought, what the hell is a tap? And of course, taps are wooden, hollowed out wooden bungs, if you like, that would be tapped into the bunghole of a barrel containing liquid to tap the liquid out. So you've got a hollow tube. The one at the top, these are both 17th century examples. The one at the top has actually got a tap on it. The one underneath doesn't appear to have one, but they're hollow tubes. And presumably Samuel Pacey had to put the tap in Elizabeth's mouth and pour, kind of like force feeding her liquids into it to give her some nourishment. So this is Elizabeth and Deborah. Now, I will say one thing I'd like to say as well, that at this point, of all the things that people, the judge, and we'll come on to him later when we come to the trial, some of this just sounds so ludicrous that you would think people were making this up, but they truly believed what was happening and that this was the result of witchcraft. So we go on now to the other accusers, and there's a lot of them. I'll go through them very quickly, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a few minutes. So We had Diana Bocking, a widow, with a 14-year-old daughter, Jane. She lived in a house in the High Street, towards the north end of the town on the east side. She lived there, and Jane Bocking, her mother had to give evidence on her part at the trial because Jane was in the court and couldn't speak. She was struck very soon, around about this time after the Pacey girls. She also was taken with strange fits of swooning. She claimed, or her mother claimed, that Jane said it was, she knew who was doing it because she sometimes, when she laid in bed, she could see the spectre, the ghost, the apparition of Amy Denny in the corner, floating in the corner of the room, pointing at her and cursing her and deriding her. So that was her evidence. Mary and Robert Chandler, their daughter Susan, aged 18. She was another one to be, she was one of the last victims. I'm going to come back to the Chandlers because Mary Chandler's evidence at the trial as a witness is very crucial when it comes to Rose Cullender. So I'm coming back to her. I'll come back to some more of these. There was John Soon. He was one of the wealthiest men in the town. He was a farmer. He had a farm. He had a farm at the back of the town hall. There was a farmhouse and a stackyard there, and that's where his farm was. Again, I'll come on to his evidence in a moment. I'm going through these fairly quick because we've got a lot of them. There was Robert Sherrington, although the trial report calls him Sheringham, but we know from the indictments that his name is actually Sherrington. He was also another fairly, well, he was a wealthy farmer. He had about 180 acres, and he was another one that claimed in his evidence at the court that at one point he'd been bewitched. Richard Spendler wasn't bewitched, but he gave evidence and pointed the finger at Amy Denny. And we'll come back to him in a moment to see what he said. Right at the bottom here, in the house below the cliff, is where Anne and Cornelius Landerfield, that's Anne Ewan, who grew up alongside, as a teenager, alongside Rose Cullender, and they lived in the house next door, literally, or below at the bottom of the score, Henfield score, from Amy Denny. Again, I'll fill some more details in later. I just want to get these up. Dorothy Durham is a very interesting case. She had two children who were bewitched, Elizabeth and William. We'll come back to them in a moment. Elizabeth was 10 years old. William Durham was 2 years old. There's Edmund. These ones at the top here, I don't know. We haven't been able to find them in the records of Lowestoft at all, where the houses were, possibly because they were only tenants and they didn't contribute to all the houses that they lived in weren't built on land that belonged to the Lord of the Manor, so their names don't appear in the Manor Court records. Edmund Durham, he gave evidence for his daughter Anne, who's described a maid. Again, he told a very similar story to Samuel Pacey, that Amy Denny had come to buy some herring off his wife, and his wife refused to sell the herring, and Amy Denny went away cursing, and Anne Durham, his daughter, a maid, fell into strange fits of swooning. And there was also another 17-year-old young lady, Anne Baldwin, who we know very little about at all, except her name. And the trial report simply says she was bewitched, as were the others. So unfortunately, we don't know much about her. So all of the names in red are the names of the people who were bewitched at some time or the other. So Dorothy Durham is an interesting case. I'm going to home in on her case because it's an incredible story. On the 10th of March, 1657, her 12-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, sorry, I've got this the wrong way around. On the 10th of March, her 2-year-old baby, she was a married woman. She was on her second marriage, in actual fact. Her husband, by occupation, was a dauber, a man that plastered the outsides of timber frame buildings with mud, called daub, plastered them with that. We don't quite know where she lived, but she told the court that on the 10th of March 1657, when she gave her evidence, she told the court that she had to go out of the house for some reason, and that she'd actually employed Amy Denny to come and babysit her 2-year-old son, William. And she told the court that she'd said to Amy Denny, whatever you do, I don't want you to put my child to the breast. I don't want you to breastfeed him. The judge said to her, to Dorothy, why did you give that instruction? And Dorothy said, because the child would only have sucked wind and would have got the colic. Presumably that makes perfect sense. So Dorothy Durham goes out of the house. She does whatever errand she has to, and she comes back, and Amy Denny is sitting in the house, and she's got the child to the breast. And Dorothy basically tells the court she lost her cool with Amy Denny, and threw her out of the house and refused to pay her the penny or the tuppence, whatever she's going to pay as a childminder. That day, that evening, young William was taken ill, and Dorothy didn't know what to do about her. In the end, she went and sought the advice of a white witch, a cunning man who actually lived in Great Yarmouth, to get some advice as to what she should do about her baby, because she thought he was bewitched. The cunning man, the white witch, said, go home, take your baby's blanket. When you get home and when you get the baby up, hang the baby's blanket in the corner by the fireplace. Leave it there all day. And then before you wrap the baby in the blanket to put into bed in the evening, give it a good shake. And if anything falls out of it, throw it on the fire. And she told the court that this is what she did. She hung the blanket in the corner all day. She took it down and shook it, and a huge toad hopped out of it. And somebody in the room picked the toad up in a pair of tongs and thrust it into the fire, whereupon, she told the court, it did make a horrible shrieking noise and then exploded like the report of a pistol, and it disappeared completely. Just as an aside, a toad is most important because, and I'll come to it in a second, before I come to why the toad is very important, the next day, a relative of Amy Denny came and knocked on Dorothy Durham's door and said to Dorothy, what have you done to my aunt? And Dorothy said, what do you mean, what have I done to your aunt? And went away and brought Amy Denny. And Amy Denny lifted her skirts in front of Dorothy Durham, and all her thigh and leg down one side were badly scorched as if she'd been in the fire. The inference being there was a connection between the toad that was put on the fire and Amy Denny. And of course, that connection is that Traditionally, it was accepted that when you became a witch, you made a pact with the devil, and the devil would give you a familiar spirit to be sent out to do your errands. And you were linked to this familiar spirit. And so by putting Amy Denny's familiar spirit in the fire and burning it, it actually transferred the burns to the host, if you like, to the witch. And in contemporary literature, we have pictures here of witches feeding their familiars. And of course, the other weird and wonderful thing about this little story is, I'm surprised the judge, who, as we'll see, was supposedly very learned, didn't pick up on it. Dorothy Durham employed Amy Denny as a childminder in 1657, but she actually told the judge that she believed that Amy Denny was a person of very evil behaviour, whose kindred and relations have been many of them accused of witchcraft. So it's possible this is the Beccles connection with the Amy as a single woman with the name Eccleton, and a relative who Linstead, who had been there. Why, if she believes her to be a very evil person, why the hell did she employ her to look after her child? I'm damn sure I wouldn't. But the story doesn't end there. Dorothy Durham then goes on to say that on the 6th of March 1659, her daughter Elizabeth, 12 years old, was ill, quite poorly, and she was laying on a settee in the house, and her mum, Dorothy, had to go out to the apothecary to get some medicine for her. And when she came back, Amy Denny is in her house, uninvited, and she's given Elizabeth a drink of water. And basically, Dorothy Durham goes ape over this and says, "What the hell are you doing and think you're doing?" Well, she didn't actually say those words, but if you read the transcript, you can get her. She asked Amy Denny what she thought she was doing, and Amy Denny probably said the worst thing she could ever say, given her reputation of a witch, we presume at that time. That Dorothy needn't worry much longer about her child, because her child is going to die. And a few days later, Elizabeth died. And of course, that's all the prophecy, the witchcraft from Amy Denny that kind of seals her fate. And she also said to Dorothy Durham, and not only will your daughter die, but you will become crippled and will have to go around on crutches. And when Dorothy Durham, whether she did it for effect or not, we'll never know, gave her evidence in the courtroom at Bury St Edmunds, she did it on crutches. Johnson, who's described as a human, a sufficient person, this is the site of where his farmhouse would have stood, that eyesore at the back of the town hall. He told the court in harvest time 1659 he'd taken some carts up to the Northfield. That's where Northfield Primary School now is, when they were just open fields. And on the way, his carts went past Amy Denny's house, which makes perfect sense, because he'd had to go on to Swan Lane, Mariner Street, to get up to the Northfield. And his cart wrenched the window of Amy Denny's house and damaged it. She came out and shouted at him and cursed him. He's described in the trial report as a human, a sufficient person. And he told the court that when he got to the field where the harvest was waiting to be taken back to the stackyard, his cart got stuck in the gateway into the field, but much to his amazement, it wasn't touching either of the gate posts. They couldn't get it through the gate, and it appeared to be stuck, and yet it wasn't touching anything. And he put that down to Rose Cullender's curse on him. Eventually, they managed to load the cart and get it back to the stackyard, and he went on to tell the court that every time his men tried to unload the cart, their noses burst forth of bleeding, and they were able to do any work until the next day. So that's John Soame, that's where he lived. Robert Sherrington gave a similar tale of woe, that in harvest time 1661, that's only the previous year before the trial, he went along the street with his cart past Rose Cullender's house and banged the wheel against the doorpost, the door frame, and damaged it. And she came out and she cursed him, and for doing that, he presumably ignored her and went on. And he said after that time, nothing went right for him. A lot of his pigs leapt up in the air and made a horrible noise and died a few days later. Some of his geese died, and he himself was afflicted with clothes were full, as he described them, lice of an extraordinary bigness, so bad that he had to burn all his clothes to get rid of the lice. And then he got some more, and the lice didn't come back. And so the tales of woe went on and on. This is in, we don't know if this is the exact place, but this is in Duke's Head Street, the old Blue Anchor Lane, where Robert Sherrington had his pub, the Sun Inn. And as I said, he was a neighbour in the 1630s to Rose Cullender. It's the same place that Anne Landerfield would have played. So these people, I'm just trying to reinforce the point that these people all knew each other. Then there's Richard Spendler. He's told the court that he heard Amy Denny say that she could not rest until she had punished Anne and Cornelius Landerfield. Didn't any more to that. As I said, this is looking down Old Nelson Street. Those two little cottages there are almost certainly 16th or 17th century cottages, and that's in one of those that Richard Spendler lived long before these big Victorian edifices were built. And it's at the bottom of this road that Amy Denny lived. She was, in actual fact, the tenant of Cornelius Landerfield, Anne's wife, who owned the property that Amy Denny lived in. And there's three incidents that Anne Landerfield said made her know that Amy Denny was a witch. The first one was she'd met Amy Denny, bought some, Rose Anne Landerfield had bought some geese at market and was walking them home down the street, and Amy Denny said to her she wanted to watch out for those geese, and a little while later all the geese fell down and died. On another occasion, as the tenant of Cornelius Landerfield, and his wife Anne said that Amy Denny came to the house and pointed to the chimney pot of the house in which she lived, which the Landerfields own, and said, if you don't look out for that chimney in the house that I'm living in, it's going to fall down. Anne Landerfield told the court that it was a fairly new chimney and it was quite safe, but 3 days later the chimney fell down, just as Amy Denny had prophesied that it would. And on another occasion, she bewitched some of the fish that was being landed from Cornelius's fishing boat, and the barrels jumped over the side of the fishing boat before they could be landed and were lost in the sea and were never seen again. So that's basically some of the evidence. You'll need to read the original report to get it all. The course of justice. It wasn't a Kangaroo Court. It was the act of witchcraft, the 1st of James the 1st, 1604, entitled An Act Against Conjuration, Witchcrafts, etc. And there was a due process. It wasn't a trial, it was a secular trial. Witches were believed to have broken the law. It wasn't anything to do with heresy, although religion did play a part in it. And the law said that witchcraft, if you could prove somebody was a witch and they'd done harm with their witchcraft, they were felons. They were the same as a murderer, a rapist, an arsonist, or what have you. And they had to be tried at the main assize court. The assize courts met twice a year only, once in the Easter period. That's the Easter court. That's the trial. That's the court that Amy Denny was tried at in March. Amy Denny and Rose Collins were tried out in March 1662. That's the Easter Assize. Then there's the Summer Assize, which was usually in August. That's the only two places where felons could be tried. But before they were tried, they had to be arrested and examined before a magistrate. And so Samuel Pacey, we're told, went all the way to get the arrest warrant from a magistrate, Sir Edmund Bacon, who I'll come to in a moment, who lived many, many miles away. And he got the warrant for the arrest of Amy Denny and Rose Colander from Sir Edmund Bacon. And the process of the law said that now the magistrate, having arrested a felon, be they a witch or what have you, a murderer, a rapist, had to then listen to the evidence of all the people who were accusing the person of the crime. In this case, Amy Denny and Rose Colander being witches. And this had to be done formally. And at this hearing, a clerk to the magistrate had to take down notes, which would be then offered up at the trial, because once the magistrate had issued an arrest warrant, he couldn't acquit. The people had to be sent to the Crown Court to be tried. And so here we have a scene of an inquisition, as they called them, with two people giving evidence before the magistrates, and there on the left you can see the clerk making notes. So here he is. Here's the man who came to Lowestoft. He lived at Redgrave Hall, 40 miles away from Lowestoft. He's the 4th Baronet of Redgrave, Premier Baronet of England, and there he is in all his finery there as Lord Lieutenant of the county. And he came to Lowestoft and heard the evidence. The puzzling thing about this is there were magistrates within a few miles of Lowestoft at this time. There was a magistrate living at Somerleyton Hall. There was others not that far away, but for some reason, Samuel Pacey in January, rode all the way to Redgrave, some 40 miles away, to get an arrest warrant for Amy Denny and Rose Colander. We'll never know why. I could now sit here and try and give 1,000 different reasons. You'll have to buy the book if you want to find out what might be going on at this point. And so he comes to Lowestoft. He has the hearing. The evidence, now again, as an aside, I have to say that it wasn't a crime to be a witch in England. It only became a crime if you use your witchcraft to harm somebody. It wasn't a crime, for instance, to carry a sword in England, but it was a crime to stick that sword into somebody and maim them or kill them. Or so, just as with any crime, any felony, you had to prove, first of all, that the person was armed and had the weapons to do that. And the same thing of her in witchcraft. It was no good sending somebody for a trial for malevolent witchcraft unless you had evidence that would stand up in the court that they were a witch and therefore could have done the things that they're being accused of by their neighbours. So the case against Amy Denny is pretty clear. There's the scorch marks, the cursing and what have you. The case against Rose Cullender that she's a witch isn't quite as clear. The magistrate needs more positive evidence that Rose Cullender is a witch. So he orders 4 women, one of them being Susan Chandler, who they lived at the Crown Hotel. Robert Chandler was the landlord of the Crown in Lowestoft, and this is the oldest part of the Crown. And his wife Susan and 3 other women were sent round the corner into not Duke's Head Street, into Mariner Street, Swan Lane. They're the ones that went to Rose Cullender's house, and they searched her for witches' marks. Witches' marks, as I'm sure some of you might have heard, were supernumerary teats somewhere on a woman's body, usually in very secret places where the imps could come and suck to get nourishment from the witch's blood. These teats were thought to be very obvious, particularly that they were totally insensitive to pain. So if you pricked them, if they were witches' marks, the woman wouldn't feel anything. They claim to have discovered witches' marks on Rose Cullender. They don't go into any detail except they were close to her fundament, and we'll leave it there. And she said they weren't witches' marks, Rose did, that they were strains that she'd got through carrying heavy loads of water. But the women convinced the magistrate that she was a witch, and so she too was sent for trial in March. So this takes place on the 2nd of February, the searching 1662. And the trial was held at Bury St Edmunds at the Shire Hall on the 10th of March 1662 at the Grand Jury House. Here's Sir Matthew Hale, the Lord Chief Baron of His Majesty's Exchequer, the 2nd most senior judge in the whole of England. He's the one that sat as judge at the trial. And the courtrooms back in those days weren't kangaroo courts. They were very, very well appointed courts in most places. This is the full majesty of the law. This is a still extant 17th century courtroom. Bury's would have been a little bit like that. Unlike today, although they still have in America, they had the grand jury system, and the grand jury system was such that before any indictments could be drawn up and the trial take place, each of the people, including the 2 accused, each of the witnesses had to, in private, be examined by a grand jury to take their evidence. And there's usually about 16 men. There's no women involved in any of the juries. 16 men on the grand jury. They would listen to what everybody said. They would look at the notes that were made by the magistrate when he'd done the hearing, and then they'd weigh everything up and then decide whether the accused should stand trial at the court of Oyer and Terman, the main court, to hear and determine whether they were guilty or not, or the grand jury could throw out the accusations and discharge the prisoners. The grand jury in the case of Amy Denny and Rose Cullender decided that the 2 women were guilty of what had been or they needed to stand trial before their peers for what they had done, and so the indictments were drawn up. And here's one of the original indictments against Rose Callender and Amy Denny, written in Latin and translated. I'm not going to read it all out, but they're basically the same wherever you go in different witchcraft trials and that. If they had typewriters back then, they'd have been typed up and printed, and you just filled in the blanks with the names and the dates. But the most important thing says here, where are we? Just got to find it. It says the king's sworn officers maintain upon their oaths that Rose Callender, late of Lowestoft, in the aforesaid county, widow, on the 2nd day of February in the 14th year of the reign of our Lord Charles II, King of England, blah 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 blah, etc., being a common witch and enchantress, not having God before her eyes, but moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, did at the aforesaid Lowestoft in the aforesaid county violently, unlawfully, diabolically, and feloniously, and use, practice, and employ certain evil and diabolical fascinations. And this is in Latin, remember. So they've written in English witchcrafts and incantations in English, enchantments on one Susanna Chandler, spinster, then and there living in, and so it goes on and on. And so they draw up the indictment, and there's not just the one. Across the top, we'll come to the number of indictments in a minute. Across the top, written in Latin, this is as close as we can get to that moment in the trial when the trial has taken place. This is the original indictment drawn up by the clerk of the court after the grand jury had decided that Rose and Amy should stand trial. Across the top there, it says Pacey, which in actual fact is a contraction for Pussy non cul, or culpabus. It means they pleaded not guilty. The next little contraction that you can see along the top, the clerk of the court is writing this as the trial proceeds. Pussy, guilty now. Non-colour, I can't remember what that's the contraction for, but that's the contraction that they had no goods or chattels over and above a certain amount. If they were wealthy, their goods and chattels could be confiscated and given to the crown. And the last one, written as the judge delivers his sentence, to be suspendendi per column. Sus per col, he's written there. The Latin for suspendendi per column, to be hanged by the neck. So that's as close as we'll ever get to the fate of these two women. This is as immediate as we get. This is talk, by the way, has gone on much longer than I thought it would, so I'm probably going to adjourn the case until we continue this next week. There's still a bit more that I want to run through. But so how many indictments were there? There were no less than 14 separate indictments drawn up against Rose Callender and Amy Denny. If found guilty on any single one, they could and probably would have been hung. But there's 14 of them there. The interesting thing is the trial report, whether intentionally or not, we don't know. When the guy, we presume it's a guy who wrote the trial report, the one that I had the printed copy of there, he says they were found guilty on all indictments, of which there were 13 in number. He doesn't actually say that one of them was thrown out by the jury. That was the one, that was Sherrington with his lice of great bigness. Apparently, the jury didn't believe that anybody was guilty of doing that. neither of the women were guilty of doing that. So we go to the courtroom, and at that point, I am actually going to stop the talk because I realise now it's 9:10 and time is getting away. I can finish this briefly next week. It's very important, the next section. I don't want to have to rush through it. I want you to get a real picture of this. So at that point, I'm going to, I hope you forgive me if I do this. My voice is going as well, by the way. I'm going to have a, and we'll use the, since we're in the courtroom, we will adjourn the hearing until next week, if that's okay with everybody. Over to you.
Ivan, I think that is okay with everyone. Lots of lovely comments. I'm just going to go to some, which make sure I don't repeat any. So Bridget Allender says, love listening to all the stories of years gone by. This is my third week of listening to Ivan. I love old Lowestoft history. Carly Franklin says, I'm loving listening to Ivan talk about the trial of the Lowestoft, which is very interesting. Never heard it before. Chris Collins says, Lowestoft has an enormous amount of history and it's all fascinating. Thanks to Ivan for sharing it with us. Christina Jenkins says, this is very interesting and strange. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And Karen Harris says, brilliant. But actually, I want to really feature this comment, Ivan, because I think Sue here really hits the nail on the head. She says, really good to have met the women first. And I think that was a lovely feature, a lovely element to the way you did it, because we knew the women before at least we knew them as branded as witches. So yeah, and several more comments as well. Lots of lovely comments. Lizzie Longton, absolutely fascinating. Jenny, I'm not going to try and pronounce your surname because I will embarrass myself, but she says, really fascinating, thank you. Jerry Paul says, brilliant as always, Ivan. John Ward, many thanks, Ivan. Lots of other comments as well. I'm sure people would absolutely forgive you for, it doesn't feel like you've been going on too long, Ivan, but if you wanted to carry it over, people would absolutely enjoy that. Sue Day says, thank you, I was born in New England.
Oh, right. Whereabouts?
Whereabouts, Sue? You need to let me know. Lizzie Beth Long says, agree, it was great to know about them first. Yeah. So, and then lots of others. Susan Corkmaz says, thanks, Ivan. Linda Boyce says, thank you, Ivan. Brilliant. So a lot of love there, Ivan. Absolutely a lot of love.
Yeah.
So I think I'm just going to actually trail what we're talking about next week, because you said you were going to talk about South Lowestoft and putting Kirkley back on the map. But it sounds like we've got some unfinished business with the witches. Is that right? The witches, I'm going to say.
Yeah. If people, again, if the trouble is, I can't see or hear anybody. It's very frustrating. But if a great deal of horror went up to say we want Kirkley, then I could try and, but the Kirkley presentation again is quite a long one, but I can launch into that straight away. The only other thing that I could do, I don't know how long we're going to be doing these for, Stephen.
Well, we're locked down, I think, still. You know, people are starting to go out, but people seem to really enjoy them, Ivan. So we'll keep going until we tell them.
Well, I tell you what, I really, because this particular case is my passion, and I feel in some ways by bringing all this to light again, over and over again with the research and that, it might sound a bit daft to say, I think, but I don't believe that that Rose and Amy were witches in any sense. They probably were through the eyes of well, they definitely were through the eyes of the statutes and the law at the time, and presumably they were through the eyes of the, well, we can only assume that people really believed they were witches, and they weren't just pointing the finger at them because they didn't like them and wanted to get rid of them. It could be an element in that. But I felt, and this is one of the reasons that I continue to give talks about the Lowestoft witches and other witchcraft cases, It's because I feel that by doing that, by turning the women, the so-called witches, back into people, into women, in a little tiny way, we actually give them the justice that they never got in their life.
Yeah, yeah. Lovely.
So
Well,
that's why I feel passionate about it.
Yeah. Lot of comments actually about the witches. Chris Collins, want the witches next week, please. A lot of keys in there. Jenny Poole says, I agree. I think it has to be Ivan Lowestoft Witches Part 2.
Okay, I can do that. I can do if because I'm about 2/3 of the way through here. I do have a little bit more to add to that. The influence there was. You said we've got a lady there who's born in New England.
Actually, Ivan, she says Maine. She was born in Maine.
Oh, there's quite a lot of witch trials in Maine at this time.
Yeah.
Anyway, the thing is, this case, particularly this trial report, did play a big part, perhaps a crucial part, in the Salem witch trials that took place, 30 years later. So I could introduce that short element into it as well to explain how this case played an important role, or probably an important role, in the trial of over 200 women in Massachusetts in 1692 at Salem. So I'll bring that factor into it as well. I don't want this to become an exclusive witchcraft history lesson, but it's all part of the history of the town. And then I do promise the week after that we'll go off a completely different tangent. We'll come into the recent history, and I promise for the people who have already asked that I will do the South Lowestoft Kirkley presentation.
Lovely.
If you'll all have it. One other thing, I'm not trying to sell things, but I am. The book, the main book, is still in print. The local bookshops don't stock it because it's quite a heavy tome and it's not cheap. I think it's selling for about, if you get the paperback, for about 26 quid now, and if you get the hardback, it's £65. See, you had to pay for quality. But what I've done is, this is a very, very, very in-depth study of the trial. A lot of it thanks to my late friend, Professor Gilbert Geiss, who was a professor of criminology and a professor of psychology. So I did all the field work into the local background of the people, etc. And he, as a criminologist and a psychologist, he done the deeper thinking, if you like. Then we married the two lots of information together. So the first part of this, although it overlaps with it, but the first part of this is basically the story of the trial in some depth. And the second part is a very, very good analysis of the bigwigs employed in it, the whys and the wherefores, comparing it with other trials, what it might all mean, etc. That was Gilbert's big input into it. Thanks to Ali, the manager of Waterstones in Lowestoft, she said to me there ought to be a cheap edition of it, so that people can afford to buy it. So what I've done is, in this little booklet, as you might know from my sins, from 1976 onwards, I've had 4 editions of a little booklet called Haunted Lowestoft. The last 2 editions, we put a supplementary bit in the back. The most recent edition, which is the one I'm holding in my hand, it's got only half of this is the story. It is ghost stories from Lowestoft, because as you know, in the entrance to Bellevue yeah, Bellevue Park, just on your right as you go through, and I'm sure Chris knows of this, Chris Connors, and others who are listening. There is a pile of stones called the Witches' Stones, and it's supposedly traditionally the ghost of one of the Lowestoft witches could be seen late at night sitting on there, cursing people. And so what I did from this one, because it was an internationally published book, the publishers didn't want too much detail, local detail, Lowestoft detail in. Obviously, they wanted a look at who the characters were, but there was a lot of local information about the people in Lowestoft and their involvement in the trial that never appeared in here. So thanks to Ali, my lovely friend Ali, manager of Waterstones at Lowestoft, she persuaded me to put together another version. So what I've done is I've taken all the details of the trial, added to them the omitted details of the Lowestoft people involved, stripped away all the whys and wherefores, all the psychology, criminology, and all the other ologies out of it, and I've priced it down into this second half of it. So you've got the trial. There's lots of details of the trial in there. I haven't skipped on it, and we actually called this second section. I say we because my grandson helped me do it. Writing on the story of the Witches' Stones, the second section we called Where Witches Once Walked. So this is available, it's still available. I think Waterstone, yeah, I'm pretty certain Waterstones have got them. So that's available from Waterstones, or if you really feel naughty, you can get them from Amazon as well, but I prefer to send you to Waterstones. I don't know if the Beck Bookshop has still got copies of it. And very, very finally, and I will make this finally as well, the original trial report is there. Thanks to my clever grandson, he took this original report, scanned it, digitized it, and we produced a facsimile. So if you want to read the actual words as they were spoken, as they were written down at the trial, as they appear in here, we've got this limited edition. We only had 500 done. And this is actually the facsimile of the trial report. Again, Waterstones still sell them. And again, I'm beginning to sound like a salesman now. If you buy the two together, she gives you a special price for the two. So if you're really interested, they can exist separately. If you're really feeling extravagant, you can order a copy of this online. I think you can still get it through Waterstones online, but they don't carry them in the shop because they're too expensive. So that's me really finished, got to say. And thanks everybody.
What are the titles of those?
Sorry?
What are the titles of
okay, the one which contains the Where Witches Once Walked, that's called A Return to Haunted Lowestoft.
Yeah.
With the subtitle featuring Where Witches Once Walked.
Yeah.
And with me as the author. And the other one is called The Trial of the Lowestoft Witches.
Yeah.
And it's a facsimile of the original report of the trial of Amy Denny Rullander in 1662.
Brilliant, lovely. We'll just
I can't remember my cell phone there. Anyway, Waterstones definitely stock them, and I'm sure if you decided to buy them, Ali at Waterstones would be only too pleased. I know she's got some in stock still. She had plenty when she went to lockdown. I know she'll be only too anxious to get the trade flowing again down there. So as I said, you can get this one on Amazon, but I prefer you to go to Waterstones if you decide to buy one and support our local shop.
And actually, there's a comment from
Not sure.
Jen, and she says the trial report has pride of place on the Ivan bookshelf. There you go.
Oh, who's that from?
That's Jerry Poole.
Oh, Jerry, my dear friend Jerry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, Jerry.
Well, so look, it's been a long one, but it's been a fascinating one, and you've crammed an awful lot in. But so we have it by popular kind of demand, I guess, that next week will be the Witch Trials Part 2, which is good news. Which is good news because I've been fascinated, and I know a lot of other people have as well. So Steve Fingleton says, looking forward to next week. Thanks, Ivan. Lizzie Beth Long says, only recently heard of the Witch's Stones. Then what else? Several more comments anyway. They're just sort of moving around for me at the moment. But thanks once again. I'll just give tomorrow a quick plug, if I may, and that is that we do a separate broadcast called the Shanty Sessions, and that is on the same page here, the Rogues Shanty Chorus Facebook page. We're also on YouTube. Just search Rogues Shanty Chorus on there. And it's kind of mostly sea shanties, maritime music, with hopefully now and again with a provenance that we found that where they've been sung locally or certainly off the coast of East Anglia at Lowestoft. And we generally tend to have a couple of special guests on that. Tomorrow we've got 2 Lowestoft guys. We don't always go quite so local. Last week we had somebody from Barcelona. But we've got Zeb Soanes, the broadcaster, Lowestoft born and bred, and probably if you listen to the shipping news or the shipping forecast, you'll know him for that. And then John and Lynn Ward. John has been watching tonight, and local musicians known much further afield for their fantastic folk music. So that's tomorrow on this channel, 7:30 p.m. But tonight we've been with Ivan Bunn. Thank you very much. This is for episode 5. Episode 6 is the Lowestoft Witches. Episode 7, I think, is putting Kirkley back on the map, and then we'll find out what the others will be. And if you haven't caught us from the beginning on this, then you can just watch again. You can rewind this, or you can watch again. But please do click share. And I think, as I usually do, Ivan, I'll give you the chance to just have the final words. But thank you very much from me anyway.
You are, and my final word is thank you, Steve, for giving me the opportunity to do this. Thanks everybody who tune in, maybe so call it, who've been watching this evening. And really all this is, I know things out there are beginning to get a little bit easier, hopefully, but nevertheless, be cautious, take care, stay well, and hopefully we will be back together this time next week. Night night.
Thank you.